morning. Thank you for being here for today's genealogy program. Today is March 8th, 2025, and we will be learning about Harvey houses. Before we get into that, I do want to make a few quick announcements. I'm Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center here in Canyon City. And we've got some exciting news. We have a dual exhibit opening coming up. That'll be March 28th at the museum, so 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard in Canyon City. So March 28th from 4 to 6 p.m. That'll be open to the public. We invite you to come down, invite any of your family, your friends, neighbors to come down. We will be opening our two new exhibits. So the one is Advance into Nature, a County of Recreation. And so that is in place to celebrate all the different ways that we do outdoor recreation here in Fremont County, which is a lot. And our museum curator, Steve Groff, has been working hard on putting that together. And then the other exhibit is called Miners to Merchants, the Italian Heritage of Fremont County. And so that's been another big project for us, working on the Italian American heritage here. And it's a pretty interesting, really rich history. And so it's been a lot of work. We've been working in cooperation with the Sons and Daughters of Italy and have a lot of really great stuff put together. So we hope to see you there. The exhibits will be open, moving forward. But if you can make it down for the opening, that'd be great. It's March 28th from 4 to 6 at the museum. And one other thing to touch on really quick, we've put together a committee of organizations here in town, and we're starting discussions on how, as a county, as a community, how we're going to celebrate next year in 2026. Colorado is celebrating its sesquicentennial anniversary, so 150-year anniversary. And our nation will be celebrating its semi-quincentennial anniversary, so the 250-year anniversary. So we're working with a bunch of different organizations around town and in discussions about how we want to celebrate both of these monumental events. So stay tuned. We're going to have some stuff planned for that, and that'll be 2026. So we've got a little time on that. Okay, well, thank you for giving me that moment to make the announcements. I will hand over to our presenter, Terri Meeks, who's going to teach us about Harvey houses.
Good morning and welcome. And today our topic is the Harvey houses and the Harvey girls who worked at these Harvey houses. The one on the cover here is the Castaneda in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and we will be seeing it again in this presentation. So we're going to start with a little bit of railroad history. They did play a large part in the development of the United States. As the Northeast became industrialized, starting in the 1820s, it became imperative to have railroads to transport goods from the manufacturing areas, the farming areas, to the major cities. And with the settlement of the West, starting in the 1850s, it became equally important. They needed railroads to get goods from the East to the West, as well as the farm produce from the West back to the East. The railroads were one of the major increases in speed. They allowed for the transportation of a lot of goods at a much faster rate and at a lower cost than previous steamboat or overland methods. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad opened in 1827, and it was the first passenger and freight line within the United States. The South had constructed short lines. It was important for them to get their farm produce, cotton, tobacco, etc., to the ocean and river ports. So they had a whole network of very short lines. The North and Midwest also built networks where they were linking cities. And by 1860, practically every city was linked in some way, shape, or form with a railroad. The Corn Belt in the Midwest, over 80% of farms were within 5 miles of a railway. So, an interesting statistic there. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869, and by 1890, a number of the short lines had been consolidated into 20 large trunk lines. By 1910, the entire rail system pretty much was stabilized. And we see from this point that trucks, the introduction of trucks, are going to start to erode the freight traffic. And as well with automobiles, people are going to go for those private automobiles rather than rail traffic. And of course, later on with the introduction of planes and the faster commute between large cities, we see that the railroad traffic is going to drop off. By after 1940, diesel electric locomotives had completely replaced steam. So what was the train like in the 1800s? There was an engine, there was a tender with coal and water, there were mail cars, freight cars, luggage cars, and passenger cars. And travel was not easy. In your basic second-class car, you had a slightly padded seat. The windows were usually open, and they were by each seat, and it made for dirty travel. Most of these were run with coal, so that as the coal burned, the coal dust wafted back over the rear compartments. So it was not exactly a comfortable journey. Many of them did have fresh paint. They did have a monthly cleaning service. And for the most part, local businessmen and middle-class families were the passengers on these trains. There was first-class travel as well, and it was quite luxurious. It was interesting that the first-class trains had the right-of-way, and that slower trains had to move to the side rails to wait for the first-class travelers to pass. Mr. Pullman came along in the 1860s, and he introduced the first sleeper. His cars were called palace cars, and they were anything but. The Pullman sleeper did carry the body of President Lincoln when he was assassinated from Washington, D.C., back to his home in Springfield, Illinois, where he was buried. And the train made stops at many of the cities and towns for people to pay their respects, but it was a Pullman car. In 1867, he introduced what was called the President, that a sleeper car that had an attached kitchen and a dining car. And he actually built an entire town to produce his Pullman sleeper cars. He used African-American porters on his sleeper cars. And it's interesting to note that President Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was the president of the Pullman Palace Car Company. So he started by taking coaches and rebuilding them. He made the seats out of adamantine, The cars were lighted by candles, and they had some wood burning stoves at the end of the cars to provide a little bit of heat. There was a toilet-like facility at the end of the car, as well as a wash basin, but it was not, the wash basin at least was not private. There were 10 upper and lower bunks. And it was interesting, they did provide blankets, but they did not provide sheets. So the first overnight trip was made from Bloomington, Indiana to Chicago on the Chicago and Alton line. And here is a picture supposedly of one of the first Pullman sleepers. And I don't see where the beds fold down, but or any of the other amenities that were listed previously. I do see the stove at one end for heating. So a couple of years later, in 1865, the first modern sleeper was built. He no longer used the coach chassis, but built from the ground up. And this car was longer, higher, and wider. And because of that, it necessitated that bridges and platforms had to be modified along the rail routes. So they did have folding upper bunks that were on hinges, and they folded up during the day for storage. And they had reclining chairs that also doubled as beds. And at this point, no sharing of bunks was required. So they did add enclosed platforms at the end of the cars. And here we see the more modern. Pullman went on to invent smoking cars, reading cars, parlor cars that were quite elaborate. They had carpeted floors and mirrors in gilded frames, washstands out of marble and walnut, frescoed ceilings, and their dining cars became a regular feature in the 1880s. It is interesting to note, here is a picture of a Pullman parlor car. Note the chandeliers, the fine woodwork, and another Pullman parlor car. These cars, for the most part, ran east of the Mississippi River. They did not come west of the Mississippi when they were first introduced. So how did people dine when traveling long distances? In the early days, in the 1860s, there was little thought given to dining, whether it was good dining or poor dining. The trains had to stop to resupply either wood, coal, or water. And that was the opportunity for passengers to alight from the train. They had approximately 20 minutes to find food and consume it or bring it back onto the train. And of course, many passengers realizing all of this, they brought their own box lunches. There were a group of enterprising young boys, for the most part, a couple of them were girls, that were called news butchers. They would be at a train stop and they would get on the train and sell newspapers primarily, but they also had apples, candy, books, some snack type items. They would get off at the next stop and they would work the train going back in the opposite direction. So, and along the way, they started building station houses, and restaurants subcontracted to provide food at the terminal. And of course, this introduces us to one of the best, the Fred Harvey houses. Here are a pair, I assume a brother and sister, that are news butchers. So, who was Fred Harvey? He was an immigrant from England who came to the United States when he was 17 years old, and he got a job in New York City as a pot scrubber and busboy at a restaurant. He learned the restaurant business and the importance of quality service, fresh ingredients, and also the handshake deal, which would become a fundamental in the establishment of his line. He worked his way up to a waiter and eventually a line cook. And he didn't stay long in New York City. Here is the 1851 British census, where he is living at home with his family in England. But he didn't stay long in New York City. He moved to New Orleans, where he tried to start a cafe, and it didn't work out. His partner wasn't reliable, so he moved to St. Louis, and here again he started a cafe. He worked for the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, which had the nickname of being horrible and slow jolts. He actually was a mail sorter on the train. When the train went from one location to another, he would be sorting the mail. He worked his way up the corporate ladder in this, and he eventually transferred to Leavenworth, Kansas, and he worked as a freight agent there. Because of his many travels, he was exposed to the food, and having known quality food, he saw that he was not sharing in the best of opportunities there. So here we see him in 1860. He's a restaurant keeper. And in 1870, he's a railroad clerk. So he's just embarking on his career. In 1875, he did open 2 cafes on the Kansas and Pacific Railroad with a partner, Jeff Rice. And his locations were in Wallace, Kansas, and in Hugo, Colorado. He also worked as an advertisement solicitor for the Leavenworth Conservative, a newspaper. He and Mr. Rice had a falling out, and their business dissolved, but it was his work as in advertising that actually allowed him to walk away with a reasonable sum of money. He had a friend, Guy Potter, and Potter, we see, is a railroad agent from the Topeka City Directory, and he managed Harvey's first Topeka lunchroom. Wanting to expand his network, Harvey took a proposal to the Burlington and Quincy Railroad, and they were not interested at all. So in 1876, he went to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, and they allowed him to open his first restaurant in Topeka. The restaurant was a lunchroom, and it was upstairs in the station. And that didn't deter any of the diners. They were willing to go upstairs to eat. 2 years later, he opened his first hotel restaurant in Florence, Kansas. And by 1891, there were 15 Harvey House restaurants. At their peak, which was probably in the early 1900s, there were 84 Harvey houses, and they were located approximately 100 miles apart. I mentioned that he learned the art of the handshake. His deal with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad was on a handshake. His Topeka restaurant that opened in that upstairs station was a 20-seat lunchroom. And he contracted to open several others on an experimental basis. And he promised that people would get good food in 30 minutes. So he was catering to the growing number of train passengers. And by 1878, he started the first eating house and hotel establishments. His line originally started in Kansas and moved westward. He eventually went to California and expanded also into Texas and Oklahoma, and eventually 15 states with over 60 locations. He provided both fine dining, luxury lodgings, and he later had guided tours, and we'll see part about that. But he also had simple lunchrooms where the fare was a little bit less, and it was always within that 30-minute time frame or less. During World War II, he served meals on the troop trains. And at that point, the Harvey organization was the 6th largest food retailer in the United States. So he had a legacy of good food, dedication to his customers, decent treatment of employees, and preservation of local traditions. And it's interesting to note that he actually visited every one of his Harvey houses. And it was usually an unannounced visit to see how everything was working. Even after he died, his company, his children took over the company, and they did these unannounced inspections all the way into the 20th century. He had stringent and exacting standards, and they had to live up to it. There was a large staff at each one of these locations. There was a manager, a chef, a head waitress, usually 15 to 30 Harvey girls, and we'll talk more about them. But he had bakers, butchers, assistant cooks, pantry girls, housemaids, and busboys, everything that it took to run restaurants as well as hotel accommodations. And they became so popular that he had the motto, "Meals by Fred Harvey," and you knew what you were going to get. And there's another picture of the Castaneda Hotel at the bottom. So how did he get the fast service? The meal orders were taken in advance for the dining room or for the lunch counter. When passengers got on the train, so the conductor or porter went through and took the orders for the meals. And that information was telegraphed ahead. So that way the manager at the restaurant would know how many people to expect, and he could plan accordingly. When the orders arrived, the kitchen crew hopped into action, as did the Harvey girls who were going to serve the meals. When the train was approximately 1 mile from the station, the engineer blew the whistle. And that was the signal to have the first course set out on the table or the counter. An attendant, when the train arrived, an attendant stepped outside and he hit a gong once. And the waitresses had that first course on the table. When the train stopped completely, the gong was hit several times, passengers alighted, they were seated, and they were served. It was really interesting. They had something that was called the cup code. And the Harvey girl, the waitress, they worked in pairs, and one would go through and she would take the order of what was the drink that the passenger wanted, and the second girl would actually do the serving. And the code was that they would tip the cup upside down to mean that the person wanted hot tea. If it was right side up, they wanted coffee. If it was upside down and tilted against the saucer, it was iced tea. And if it was upside down and away from the saucer, they were milk drinkers. So the cup code. It's also interesting to note that people were traveling long distances. They were not forced to eat the same thing at each one of the stops. If a passenger had chicken for lunch, then they were going to have steak for dinner. They never had the same meal 2 times in a row. And the meals were rotated every 4 days. The meals initially cost 50 cents, then went up to 75. And by 1918, World War I, the cost was $1. The lunch counter cost a little bit less, but there was less variety also. And railroad workers could also eat in the Harvey houses. They were paid 25 cents for meals. It is interesting to note that in order for a gentleman to come into one of the restaurants, one of the dining, they had to have a jacket. And if they did not have a jacket, the Harvey company provided one for them so they could eat in the lunchroom. 15 minutes before the train departed, the attendants notified the diners, and then again at 10 minutes left to go. And the house manager finally assured the conductor that all the customers had finished and were on board, and the train then departed. All of this happened in approximately a 30-minute time frame. Here is a copy of a menu from the La Fonda Hotel in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it was a Harvey house. There was a spur that went into downtown Santa Fe, and you can see the various offerings on the menu. So, how did the Harvey girls come about? In 1883, Harvey had a whole line of waiters working, and he was very dissatisfied with their attitude, their service, and so he fired them all and turned around and hired women in their place. He placed ads in Midwestern and Eastern publications looking for single women between the ages of 18 and 30 years old. It's really interesting to think about society. We are talking about 1883 to approximately the early 1900s. Women did not leave home alone. They might have graduated from high school. They might have then gotten married and established families, but women did not go off and have careers or enter into the business world at this particular point in time by themselves. So this was a radical change. The Harvey Company actually set up an employment office in Chicago to review the applications that they were receiving. The young women had to be of good moral character, well mannered, attractive, intelligent, and have at least an eighth grade education. They actually traveled to Kansas City where they were interviewed, and if they passed, offered employment. They underwent 6 weeks of intensive training where they learned the rules of etiquette, how to properly set a table, ensure none of the customer-made Harvey plates or glasses were cracked or chipped. And they worked with a smile, no matter what. Once they completed their training, they were usually sent to a rural town to work in a Harvey house. They signed year-long contracts, and they were not allowed to marry until they had worked a full year. Although Harvey himself was not extremely stringent on this, he did allow young ladies to break their contracts prior to that full year of service. The girls resided in housing adjacent to the restaurants, whether it was either a part of a hotel or a boarding house in the nearby neighborhood. And they were supervised by the most senior girl. There were curfews, and they were chaperoned male visits. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. So they were kept busy. They earned $17.50 per month with their room and board, and they did receive liberal tips. They were very, their personalities were very strong. They had uniforms. Everything was precise and precision run. So they did earn those liberal tips. And they had free trips on the railroad. So approximately 5,000 girls moved out west to work and ultimately marry, which came up with Will Rogers' comment that Fred Harvey kept the West in food and wives. Over the course of the entire time, approximately 100,000 women worked as Harvey girls. And whole families worked for the Harvey organization. It was a very cohesive and unified group. One instance that I found where was a Katie Klink or Klink. She was a widow with a small son. Her sister Mary also worked at a Harvey house, and she never married. The sister Josephine worked at a Harvey house for 2.5 years. Sister Joanna worked until 1930 when she went off to study nursing. And a fifth sister, Filma, worked until 1927 when she became a nurse. So whole families worked for this organization, and especially the women thrived. So here is a picture of some Harvey girls in their uniforms. And the uniforms did change as times changed over the years. But their uniform, their hair, their makeup, the rules were dictated by Fred Harvey. They had black skirts. and the skirts were 8 inches above the floor, white aprons. They were not allowed to wear makeup or jewelry, no gum chewing. And each girl did have several sets of uniforms. So if a spill occurred, she had to change immediately. The women were not responsible for their laundry. They had a whole separate establishment where all the laundry was handled. When Harvey died in 1901, he had 47 restaurants and 15 hotels. And he also had established dining cars on the Santa Fe Railroad. His sons took over the business, and eventually his grandsons also stepped in to run the company. And it operated into the 1960s. The Harvey Company was finally sold in 1968. Here's a map from the New Mexico Santa Fe Historical Museum, showing the route from Kansas all the way out to California, primarily in the area through New Mexico. And you can see where, with those dots, you've got a Harvey house in a station approximately every 100 miles. Harvey was also known for pioneering the art of commercial cultural tourism. In the early 1900s, he created what was known as the Indian Department, and it was actually his son, Ford Harvey, that did this. One of the New Mexico managers of the Harvey system was Herman Schweitzer, and he was an art collector of Native American art. And Ford and his brother-in-law, John Huckle, he was married to Harvey's daughter, Minnie. They decided to become Native American art collectors as well. And the threesome started collecting art, and they decided to expand and establish shops in their New Mexico hotels. So they created this Indian department. They commissioned artists and photographers to create artwork to be sold in shops. Images were printed on everything from menus to brochures to promote the mystique of Indian country. So they did employ Native Americans to demonstrate the various arts of rug weaving, pottery making, and jewelry making. And starting in 1926, they had chauffeured Indian detours. They had Harvey cars and small Harvey buses. That would take passengers out for 1 to 3 day excursions where they would go into Indian settlements in New Mexico and Arizona. They had what was called a courier corps. And Harvey, his son, hired Irma Ferguson, and she had run a tour guide service in Santa Fe to establish this courier corps. They had female tour guides. They had to be college graduates with specific interest and knowledge in art, geology, sociology, architecture, and history. They wore completely distinctive uniforms. They had long wool skirts. They had an Indian velvet shirt, silver concha belts, and leather boots. And they earned approximately $150 a month plus expenses. And if they spoke Spanish, they earned $10 more. The drivers for these courier corps or these Indian detours, they were handpicked and they wore English style riding boots and breeches, cowboy shirts, and 10-gallon hats. And they earned $125 per month plus expenses. Unfortunately, the Depression ended the Indian tours. Their publicity was so popular that they published postcards, and it's some of those postcards that we'll be seeing for these various hotels. Here is a 1920 Fred Harvey tour setting out. Here is one of the postcards advertising a Harvey house in Barstow, California. As I just said, the business declined during the Depression. During World War II, Harvey did serve meals on troop trains. The standards and the quality fluctuated as need be at this particular time. There were shortages in food, and refrigeration was an issue. And they had actually troop train girls, and they only served the military on the trains. This was the first time, up until this point, most Harvey girls were white. And it was when they had troop train girls that Native American and Hispanic Harvey girls were finally hired. On the troop trains, several hundred people were seated at a time and fed with box lunches. After the war, the automobile and airplane travel led to the closure and sale of several of the Harvey houses. During World War II, they came up with a Private Pringle and created a whole story around Private Pringle. But Private Pringle liked his lunches at the Fred Harvey houses or on the Harvey troop trains. And so we see advertisements along the highways. Mary Elizabeth Jane Coulter, she is an architect. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, attended the California School of Design, but prior to moving to California, her family moved from Pennsylvania to, I believe it was Minnesota. And there, her family became friends with local Native American tribes from Minnesota. And she had an extensive collection of Native American art from that particular Minnesota tribe. So she went to the California School for Design and she apprenticed in an architect's office. She went on to teach art, drafting and architecture. And in the summer of 1902, she took a summer job decorating the Indian building in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the Alvarado Hotel. She moved to Kansas City, actually, and she worked remotely designing the curio shops and displays for the Indian tours and curio shops. And here is a picture of Miss Coulter. She had an older sister that was disabled and was responsible for her older sister's support as well. So she became an interior designer in Kansas City, and she designed restaurants, 21 hotels, and other buildings across the Southwest. Many of the buildings that are at the Grand Canyon National Park, which was indeed the most popular destination along the Harvey line, were designed by Ms. Coulter. She was the chief architect for the Harvey Company for 38 years, and she designed the Desert View Watchtower, Herman's Rest, Phantom Ranch, and Lookout Studio at the Grand Canyon. She also designed dinnerware that was used exclusively on the railroad that ran from Chicago to Pasadena, California. Here is the Desert View Watchtower that she designed. And here is some of the dinnerware. There are listings of the employees of the Harvey Houses, page after page. It wasn't just the Harvey girls, but all of those that worked at Harvey Houses and hotels, whether they served in the lunchrooms or were managers of the hotels. So a huge employment list. So let's look at a couple of Harvey girls. Here again, we have to realize that times have changed. We're looking at the late 19th, early 20th century, where women did not go out on their own. So we have Jenny Owen Hubbard. She was born in 1897 in Kansas, and she worked in the Colorado Springs Santa Fe train depot in 1920. The depot was built in 1906, and it was a home to the Harvey House. In 1921, the year after the census, she married Brian Hubbard, and by 1930, they had moved to Los Angeles, California. So here's Jenny, and we see that she is a waitress in a lunchroom. And it's only if you knew that the Santa Fe Depot was the home of a Harvey House that you would be able to make the connection. But we see all of these people that are working either as waitresses or working in the hotels. They were Harvey employees. The Santa Fe Depot was designed by architect E.A. Harrison. It opened during World War I, but it fell into disrepair after World War II. It eventually closed in 1971, and the tracks were actually removed in 1972. And here is a picture of the Santa Fe Depot in Colorado Springs. Here is their lunchroom where Jenny would have worked in 1920. We see that she's marrying 1 year later after her contract probably was fulfilled. And we see where she and her husband move out to Los Angeles, where he is a machinist and she remains as a housewife. She died in 1980 in Los Angeles. Here's another lady, Iris Westfall. She was born in 1914 in Texas, and her family moved around a lot. They moved to Mississippi by 1920 and Alabama by 1930. And by 1940, she was married to James Westfall in Clovis, New Mexico. She was a mother to two daughters, and she went on to work as a car clerk for the railroad and died in 1990. But we see Iris here working, specifically called out as working in a waitress in a Harvey house. So there are some of the census records that do specifically show Harvey House as the place of employment. Many more of them you have to put two and two together and infer. Excuse me. So she was in Clovis, New Mexico with her husband. That was the Grand Quivira Hotel. It was designed by architect Myron Church, built in 1907 when the town of Clovis was established. It had a two-story floor plan. The first floor had the waiting room, the agent's office, and the freight room. The second level had the living quarters for the railroad workers with 4 floors and a bathroom. And the restaurant would have also been on that first floor level. Here is that station. Marie Knack Zisman, she was born in 1907 in Kansas. She married in 1927 to Mr. Zisman, and he was a freight handler for a steam railway in Kansas up until the 1940s. By 1950, they were in Winslow, Arizona, where she worked at the Escalante. He continued to work for the railroad. And here we see her. She was working as a waitress in the coffee shop. And it's interesting that this is 1950 and she is a married woman. So the 1-year contract for single women did change over the decades. Following World War II in 1946, Marie Zisman, a married woman, began working in the Escalante Hotel. Her daughter was also employed there. Although Marie had no waitressing experience, she learned quickly. In an oral history interview, she recalled, "They were very strict, and you were never allowed to write anything down. You could not write down orders, regardless how big they were." So the Escalante was in Ash Fork, Arizona. One of the most of the first Harvey houses were wooden structures. Many of them, or several of them, burned. Others of them moved and became more permanent stone establishments. The Escalante was originally wood. It was destroyed by a fire and reopened in 1907 in a new structure. One of the other interesting facts is many of the hotels are named for Spanish explorers. So when you see these Hispanic names for many of these hotels, they are named for Spanish explorers. It was the most elegant hotel restaurant in Arizona. It closed, unfortunately, in 1951 and was demolished. But here is one of those publicity postcards that they printed showing it. And they all have a very, very similar architectural style. Here is the interior view of the Escalante, which also is very, very similar. The Castaneda has a similar lobby staircase structure. The lunchroom, as opposed to the dining room. And we've heard how families here are a pair of sisters. They were born and raised in Illinois. And by 1920, they're in Sapulpa, Oklahoma. They both married before 1930. Irene to a Winfield Scott and Clara to a Richard Cole. And they passed away in the late 1900s. But here we see them in the 1920 census, specifically working in Harvey houses. Fred Harvey had a newsstand in 1896 in the old Sapulpa Railroad Station. This one did not burn, but they did build a new one adjacent to it, which opened in 1907. And Harvey had a 40-room hotel, newsstand, lunch counter, and dining room in this building. It included the Edison electrical plant and Edison lights, and featured the latest in cooling, electric fans. And here is at Sapulpa Station. It's interesting to note that Clara, one of the two sisters, actually on her Find a Grave site, it calls out that she worked as a Harvey girl at the Grand Canyon. We also have managers at the Harvey houses. Mr. Plowman was from Leavenworth, and he married in La Junta, Colorado. He was employed with the Harvey Company for over 25 years, and he actually started at the bottom and worked his way up to become superintendent of the Western Division. He died in 1914 in Deming, New Mexico, but we do see that he is a manager of a hotel. And here in this is in California, but it's one of those things that unless you dig deeper into the genealogy, you don't realize that he's working for the Harvey Company. There are a couple of newspaper articles which actually state that he's in charge of the Harvey Eating House in Needles, California. And it is the El Garza Hotel in that California community that was built in 1908. Here again, it's named after a Hispanic missionary, and he was the first known European to cross the Mojave Desert. It was built by Francis Wilson. It closed in 1988 and was added to the National Historic Register in 2002. And here is a picture of the El Garzas and its lunchroom. And we see Mr. Plowman here again, simply noted as the manager of a hotel. But we know it's a Harvey house. The Castaneda, which was shown on the opening slide, it was opened in 1898, and it was Harvey's first trackside hotel. It has roughly 30,000 square feet and was designed by architect Frederick Rohrig. It was a prototype for nearly all the future Harvey properties. And there is the opening day. The Castaneda is the site for the annual Rough Riders reunion. Most of the men in Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders unit were from New Mexico, So they gather annually to celebrate that at the Castaneda. Here is the Rawlings building. This is the dormitory that's immediately across the street from the Castaneda. And we'll look at another gentleman, Owen Guy Hayes, excuse me. He was born in Washington, D.C. He married, and he was employed as a baker throughout his life. He divorced his wife, Margaret, in 1921 in Arizona, and he stayed there in 1920. He's a pastry man. In 1930, he's a baker. So he was a career Harvey House employee. And it's interesting to see these pages of people that are identified as working in hotels, but nothing specific. Oops. The El Tovar at the Grand Canyon was another one named after a Spanish explorer with pictures. There are cookbooks from Harvey Houses. And where do we find this information? If you come across somebody that's working at a hotel, how do you dig deeper to find this? Well, you look at your census information, and because many of the Harvey girls might have only been employed for a year or two, they do not show up so much in census records. So they require further digging. Newspaper articles, that listing of employees is widely circulated. If you do a Google search for a hotel name or looking for Harvey Hotels, there are also numerous books about the Harvey system and Harvey girls in particular. We see a Harvey house, and we see that L.J. Pritchett is the manager of this New Mexico Harvey house in 1913, not a census year. We see World War II draft registrations that specifically list Fred Harvey House as the place of employment. A Fred Harvey eating house, the curio shops, and we find numerous employees at the Grand Canyon. The Fred Harvey News Department at the Grand Canyon. Marriage indexes that indicate people worked at the curio stores. And in Belen, I think that's how you pronounce it, New Mexico, there is a Harvey House Museum in that Harvey House Hotel. The Fred Harvey home in Leavenworth, Kansas also has a lot of information. And if you visit any Harvey hotel, they usually have a small exhibit along with literature, cookbooks, books, etc. So I want to thank you for joining me this morning, and hopefully you've learned something about Harvey houses, railroad traffic, and Harvey girls.
Thank you so much, Terri. That was just fascinating. What a ambitious guy Harvey was, and what a incredible opportunity for those young women. Pretty neat. I was really impressed with the systems. I mean, absolutely everything, from the cup code to the 6-week training program, the uniform standards, even how those lunchrooms were designed. Everything was just dialed in for consistency and efficiency. Pretty neat. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next time.